Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. Welcome to lecture 4 of grade 2. Today's topics are river play and range construction on the river. We're going to be deep diving today into a couple of the most common and important river spots for your win rate. We're going to be discussing spots that arise after what we're going to refer to as scattered aggression from an opponent. What happens when we face scattered aggression is that somebody has bet one street and checked the next one, or vice versa. The two spots we're going to focus on today are river probe, when we face the scattered aggression of a flop c-bet and then a turn check. And then we're going to look at bet check bet, where we have been the one implementing scattered aggression by betting the flop, checking back the turn, and then having the opportunity to bet the river. If we can master these two spots, we're going to make significant strides in understanding how to craft river betting ranges everywhere in the game tree. Let's get started. So we'll begin with a bit of a revision exercise. Big blind versus button, check call, facing a big bet on Queen Jack 6 in a single raise pot, check check on the turn, and then we arrive on the river. This is mostly a revisory exercise, but I think it'll be beneficial for us to trace what happens to big blind's range as it progresses through this hand. Big blind's range evolution goes as follows. Firstly, when big blind lands on the flop and then procedurally checks with range, big blind is suffering. The reason for this is threefold. Firstly, just being out of position will lower EV. Secondly, big blind is suffering from a large range disadvantage. Button's equity is going to be much higher than big blind's. And thirdly, big blind also has a nut advantage to boot. Not having any combos of queens or jacks is not that helpful, and having less combos of overpairs, queen X, is also going to be detrimental to big blind's equity. On the other hand, button is not going to be dominating this flop like he will some other flops, but this is still a relatively decent board for button's range. Another problem for big blind's range here is just the higher density of lower cards, a higher concentration than what button will have, because of course button's lower cards, while they exist, they're diluted by big offsuit combos, the likes of which big blind will 3-bet pre-flop, as well as big pairs, same thing there. Another thing that happens after this call though, is that big blind will gain the range advantage. By shedding all of the worst equity hands in your range, you're going to significantly boost the equity of your range, and big blind actually becomes an equity favorite on the turn here at the point where they check. This wouldn't be the case for all turns, but for most turns, big blind is going to retain that advantage that they gain by calling the flop. The thing for button here is that they're going to have to be polarized, semi-selective about what they bluff, but button is still in a favorable world on the turn in terms of EV. Remember that having a range advantage, meaning doing well in terms of equity, and actually being in a favorable EV world are not the same thing. The nut advantage is strongly with button on the turn, as well as the positional one, and therefore button still will return an EV pot share of more than 50% pot, although their equity will not be that high. So this is still an unfavorable world for the big blind at this point, but this next action by button is incredibly influential on the overall range versus range outlook. When the button checks back, remember the pattern of aggression followed by passivity on the very next node. This is always going to significantly weaken a range. Button's range on the deuce of hearts cannot support just bluffing with air all the time, but the very best hands in the range do have to keep betting for the urgency of pot building or value. What this will do is it will mean that while the checking range is not completely unprotected, it is shifting towards a higher concentration of medium and bad hands. This will give big blind a sizable EV advantage to go with the range advantage they previously garnered. At this point, big blind's range advantage will also increase because the equity goes up facing this weakening action. Thus, we arrive on a river probe opportunity. Big blind has the chance to bet one of these sizes, and we're going to be using a lot of these sizes today. Contrary to our approach on the flop and the turn, where for the most part we're looking to simplify to one or maybe two sizes maximum, on the river it may be correct to have more than that. The reason for that is something we're going to refer to as a messy out of position toolkit. When you're out of position on the river, your range can choose a few different bet sizes because each hand must now be a bit more precise about how much money it invests. This is the final chance to reach the investment ceiling determined by your hand's equity. Remember, the primary thing that affects, in poker theory, how big you can value bet and how much money you want to put in by the end of the hand is your equity. As we are now at the final lunge towards the investment ceiling, hands have to be precise. Imagine that you were doing a homework exercise and you only had a limited amount of time to submit that assignment. Let's say you had an hour left. You would have to spend all of that hour working on that assignment if it was a 1 hour long task. If you had 2 weeks to do it, you wouldn't. Think of the earlier streets as still having a lot of time left to meet your deadline. Think of the river as that final push. If there's still betting to be done, It should be done to the maximum in spots like this, with certain exceptions allowed, such as removal effects, villain's range polarity and how often you're getting raised, and some other things that we'll leave for now for grade 3. Let's talk a bit more about equity and EV. If you did grade 1 of the Carrot Poker School, you'll be very versed in my definitions of these notions. If not, it's good to brush up. Equity is a percentage, and so it will be expressed with this icon here. There's obviously a pie chart, and then EV, which is a bit more like a measurement or gauge. Equity describes the hypothetical percentage of the time that our hand or range would win versus villain's hand or range, depending on which sort of outlook we're having here, if we were to go to showdown. EV, meanwhile, describes the average monetary gain or loss across the entire game tree, from the point of reference onwards for a hand, range, or action. So we can describe the EV of a hand by saying this hand is entitled to 84% of the pot. We can describe the EV of a range by looking at how much of the pot we get compared to what villain gets in theory, and we can describe the EV of an action by comparing one action to another action and noting which one is better. Of course, in poker, our goal is to maximize EV and not just have it be above 0. Only thing that has an EV of 0 is folding or an equivalent EV play. You don't want to be trying to do better than folding when you're not even facing a bet. Equity only has one ingredient: frequency. Equity describes how often we're going to win the pot based on the merit of our hand strength. So there's nothing really else going on here. Equity is simply a hypothetical percentage of showdown wins compared with showdown losses if we were to go to showdown with the present set of circumstances in place. In other words, nobody folds, and equity does not take into account how much money we win, merely how often we would win. EV, meanwhile, has two ingredients: how often does a certain thing happen, and how good or bad is it when it happens. Your opponent turning a set against you is an incredibly bad thing, but it happens almost never, and so EV-wise it's very irrelevant. In other words, EV has a magnitude and a frequency, and that's why it's correct to see EV as a more of a linear gauge that's not in any way limited by 100%. A pie chart or circle is limited in its amount by 100%, but EV is only limited by how much is in the stack. You can win much more than the pot in EV. Remember, EV percentages can and often are greater than 100. When we're value betting, we are happy to sacrifice some of the calling frequency for the magnitude of what we win when called. Once you truly understand this fact, it really liberates you to value bet effectively and reach the investment ceiling for your hand without any fallacies intervening. Fears about not getting called, for example. The goal is not to get called. Let that resonate with you for a second. The goal of value betting is not to get called. Of course, if you were never getting called, the value bet wouldn't be very effective. But what you have to do is multiply what you're winning and the amount of time you get called in order to find the average gain from that bet. It would not be okay to simply try to maximize the frequency that you get called. Getting paid one big blind 100% of the time on the river when you have the nuts in a 50 big blind pot would be very unsatisfactory. So what does value betting do? When we value bet correctly and get called, lucky enough to get called I should add, our equity goes down. Well, I thought value betting was a good thing. Well, it is, but your opponent's range is going to strengthen and condense. Your opponent is incentivized, in theory, to shed their air combos at the highest frequency, not their good stuff, evidently, and so your range does less well after it gets called, in terms of frequency. But as a player, you actually do better if you value bet correctly when you get called, or at least as well as checking. Your EV goes up. So your equity in the pot can go down, but your EV will go up. This is a bit like talking about starting and finishing equity, landing equity into post-filtering equity when you get called. So what we're doing here is we're trading, having a lot of a small pot before we bet, but then having a bit less, so we'll just say quite a lot now, of a much larger pot when villain calls. Note that when you're value betting, you're usually increasing the pot size a lot, exponentially you could say, as you bet multiple times. Therefore, it's perfectly satisfactory to incur 10, 15, 20% dip in equity in order to be just winning more of a bigger pot. Here's a thought experiment. Let's play a game. Pick an option. For the rest of your life, would you rather receive either option 1 or option 2? $20 on 75% of days or $100 on 20% of days? Decide now. Right now. Just decide. Assuming you've decided, and I hope you've done it within 5 seconds so we can see how your brain intuitively works here, I'd like you to go into the calculation tank now. Try and figure out how much money you're actually getting per day with each of these options. Did your calculations match your instincts? If they did, you're actually in the slight minority of poker players. I've run this course as a live class quite a few times, and on average out of a class of 10 students, around 6 to 7 of them actually choose option 1 here. They like the feeling of regular payment at a high frequency, even when the amount they're getting is smaller. They don't like the thought that they only receive money on 20% of days. Option 1 will only net you $15 a day. 75% of 20, again, multiplying frequency with magnitude, is $15. 20% of 100 is $20 per day. It's much better to choose option 2. You will blunder exactly $5 per day by making the wrong choice here. Yearly, that's a lot of money, it's nearly $2,000. You want to avoid that mistake. This is the poker equivalent of electing to bet smaller in order to seek the feeling of a more frequent reward than to bet bigger and go for a larger reward that might add up to more EV in the long term. Why are we wired to choose option 1? Why do 6 to 7 out of 10 students pick this option? It's because we actually sustain ourselves biologically and physically with regular intakes of resources. Suddenly having a year's worth of food in one day is useless because most of that food will spoil. Getting a little bit delivered to you each day, however, would keep you alive very well. Back in the day, we hadn't really invented refrigeration or freezing things, so it makes sense why we're wired in this way. We seek to gather things little and often. In poker, there's also a bunch of fallacies that exist that further dictate why people are basically magnetized to more frequent payouts, and this causes a lot of EV loss in the game of the beginning and intermediate poker player. Here are some bet sizing pitfalls. The half-blind pitfall is extremely common. It's completely absurd and it misses the entire point of EV, which is a pretty big deal for a poker player to misunderstand and practice the very concept that lies at the heart of everything. EV is everything. When you give a solver a spot to solve, the algorithm which it runs is completely based on maximizing EV with your range against your opponent's range over the long term, and also with every hand in a vacuum right now against your opponent's equilibrium strategy. EV is the be-all and end-all of poker. Yet, it's very common for people to only focus on either magnitude or frequency, and not both, when making an investment, especially when value betting. This happens when bluffing too, and let's take a look at some of these pitfalls now. This one, I was afraid he'd fold to the bigger bet here. I mean, what calls? This is almost preempting the fold because we're afraid of it. If you think about what fear really is, it's an anticipation of an unwanted circumstance. We're almost manifesting that circumstance on the stage of our mind. We're playing it out in advance in order to show ourselves that we don't want that to happen and to take action that allows us to avoid that circumstance from coming into fruition. So here what the student's doing is actually being overly negative and critical about what our opponent could be calling with, making gigantic assumptions like he'll never pay off a pot-sized bet with anything. And language is a big deal here as well. We often word things in a destructively strong way in poker that really harms our EV and our understanding, because poker is, after all, a game of frequencies. But this will only consider frequency. Yes, if you bet bigger, your opponent folds more often, and there's less of the time that you receive that gratification, that positive emotion of being called when you have a really strong hand. We all like that feeling. It's like Christmas Day, it's like getting a present on your birthday. It's a very satisfactory thing to experience as a human. The problem is that in poker it's completely correct in many spots, as we're going to see in a minute, to actually neglect frequency in order to focus on how much you can win when you get called. If you're in a spot where you're never getting raised, it's a mathematically proven thing that you should bet as big as possible on the river, because that's the last chance to get value. For the river, you can make significant strides towards your investment ceiling without betting the maximum sizing. So that's a bit different. I wanted to get maximum value. This only considers magnitude. So when you see, for example, a recreational player suddenly shove for 6x pot in a tiny pot when nothing has happened, what does that player have 95 to 100% of the time? That's right, they have the nuts. Because it's simply not tempting to make this sort of risk into a small pot with a bluff, even though that would be okay theoretically in many spots. But this is usually motivated by the kind of greed actually starts to only consider magnitude. This isn't as bad as only considering frequency. In GTO terms, it's much less of a mistake to try to get really greedy and make the maximum than it is to just get called at all costs. It's much better to go all in with the nuts for 4x pot than it is to bet 10% pot in position on the river, unless your opponent's raising a lot. So in these situations, we want to be wary of thought processes that either ignore frequency or ignore magnitude. The right sizing needs to be chosen by looking at the equity tier of your hand and thinking about what it wants to do in theory. The process of deviating from the theoretical bet size for your hand is quite an intricate one that involves understanding how your opponent is likely to react to all kinds of different sizes, and also understanding the theory behind how he's meant to react. So it doesn't really cut it to just seek more money or to seek a higher call frequency. Instead, look at the equity of your hand, know in theory how big your hand would bet based on the polarization of your opponent and how much raising you can rely on happening if you bet smaller, and then choose your sizing from there. Here's another one, but he'll fold less often if I size that small. This is one people say when they're bluffing. Very often at lower and micro stakes online, in most live games across the world, small bets are underbluffed by regulars. Recreational players don't think about this so much. They actually bluff more with a small bet than a regular does. But it's very common for a reg who does something like big bet on the turn and then a very small bet on the river to simply never be bluffing. To go bigger and then smaller again when you're bluffing is deeply counterintuitive, and it flies in the face of maximizing the thing that you're seeking. But the goal of bluffing is not to maximize fold equity. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But it's true. The goal of bluffing is to maximize the ratio between investment and reward, and that might mean betting smaller. In many situations, your opponent is acting fairly inelastically to bet sizing, meaning that the fold equity you garner from increasing your sizing doesn't quite correlate enough with the increase in sizing and the amount risked, and therefore the amount lost when the bluff is unsuccessful. It's a bit like when you're purchasing something in life. It's not always best to go for the most expensive version of the product you're seeking. A lot of the time it's correct to just get a good deal and be happy that your product still has a lot of utility for the purpose for which you need it. Another one is this: risking 3x pot seems spewy to me. This is where the investment quantity has surpassed the student's comfort threshold for what they're okay bluffing. There are many spots in which you're meant to go all in for 3x pot, theoretically on the river, and with plenty of bluffs too. In fact, the bigger your sizing, the more often you should be bluffing relative to your value combos, though admittedly this should never reach 50-50. If you went all in into an empty pot, your opponent would need 50% equity, so that's the only spot where you're allowed to bluff half the time. That said, if you're risking 4x pot or something like this, your bluff frequency should be approaching 50% of your range, and it's very common for people to underbluff with these massive sizings because it's not tempting to risk that much with nothing. The way to get around this is to understand that what you're doing when you're bluffing massive like this is actually increasing fold equity dramatically, and therefore you can handle a very big hit when called because it's just working so much of the time. Things that are terrible for you are less terrible when they happen infrequently. Things that are good for you are better for you when they happen more frequently. In other words, don't worry about just one side of this coin. Try to use EV-centered approaches unless you have an exploitative read that can actually help you understand in theory how big your hand should bet based on the desires of that spot, and not get caught up on these emotional and, frankly, irrelevant thought processes. Some more sizing pitfalls now. The targeting pitfall. This came up yesterday. I made this slide yesterday afternoon, and then this came up in a private session I was having with a student. The student said, not exactly asex, but he said something to the effect of, I bet this size to target these hands in villain's range. The problem with this is that it's completely ludicrous, and the reason people say it is because it sounds convincing and appealing at first sight, and poker players are somewhat, I don't want to say they're literally sheep, it's a bit harsh, but they're certainly apt to copy what other players that they maybe respect say. And the thing is, in poker, there's a lot of content out there, which you'll know if you're watching this course, you will know how much bad content exists out there and how many people just stream, make YouTube videos, put free teaching content out there that's actually garbage. And one piece of true garbage is the targeting pitfall. The issue with this is threefold. Firstly, that one region that you're targeting, you're assuming that it's important enough to single-handedly determine the highest EV sizing. What about the rest of villain's range? Like, I understand that you think that your sizing is better against 8x here, but it might not be. You might be wrong about that because you just don't understand magnitude and frequency properly, and you're actually just trying to maximize frequency once again, and forgetting about magnitude. This happens all the time. But secondly, why is that part so special? Is it because it's a massive part of your opponent's range and it's almost all of their range? If so, then this has a bit more merit. If it's just the part that came into your head, it's arbitrary and you have no reason to select this part of your opponent's range to play against compared with other parts. It's like when people completely neglect checking as an option with a decent hand. They often say something like, I can get value, I can target X, Y, and Z, therefore I bet. It's a terrible thought process, because it doesn't compare betting to checking. I could just say I'm checking here to target villain's heir. No one ever says that. I'm checking back my top pair in the turn to target villain's heir and get him to bluff the river. It's equally invalid and it's equally valid. The point is that no matter what you target, when that's not a massive part of villain's range, you're putting the blinkers on and you're playing in this tunnel vision mode that only allows you to see a little bit of the game tree. You're basically blinding yourself to the rest of the situation. Secondly, you're assuming that you know how villain is playing this part of their range to all sizing options. That's actually what you're saying. You might think that villain will call 33% pot with ace X in some spot. The details aren't important. But what if he also calls a bigger bet at a similar frequency? Why have you stopped at 33% pot? Is it correct to stop at a sizing you're very confident your opponent will call? Or is it better to increase it to a sizing that's far bigger that you think he might call? This depends on the actual numbers, which you can't really know, and you can't really compute in time even if you do know. Maybe that second part's false, but it's very rare to be able to put all of this together and actually know which bet size is better. That's why we have theoretical guidelines that help you choose, and it's not correct to deviate from them just based on whimsical ideas like one part of your opponent's range is likely to do X. Thirdly and finally, we are capable of calculating the EV swings of each option based on this information. We're also assuming this, perhaps unjustifiably assuming that we have the power to calculate all of this. There are so many different bet sizes available to you. There's different lines available. Have you really calculated that if you check there, you make less money than if you bet the size that you're going on about when you want to bet 33% pot? Presumably not. The reason the Carrot Poker School focuses so heavily on fallacies is that bad thought processes being installed in slots where good thought processes belong is actually going to make it much harder to install those good thought processes. You can't put something into a slot that's already occupied, and so you actually have to unlearn to think in these bad ways a lot of the time before you can think correctly. Trust me, the targeting pitfall will do you more harm than good. It's a very bad protocol. Landing equity now. A much more reliable guide for establishing what sizing to use is our landing equity, or in other words, the equity you reach a decision point with. We can't calculate landing equity exactly, and we don't need to, but we can improve our skills when it comes to estimating its rough band. Here's a table that shows you roughly how big you should be betting with different types of hands, depending on the landing equity for that spot. Bearing in mind that landing equity refers to the equity of a hand before you've bet and filtered your opponent's range. The reason we don't actually use finishing equity or post-filtering equity, as we could call it, to work this out is that that's a very difficult thing to actually even learn patterns for, whereas this is much more natural. A B33 will usually require, this will depend on whether you're in position, out of position, how often you're getting raised, etc., but it will usually require 65 to 70% landing equity. The reason for this is, of course, that when you bet even small, you cause a contraction in your opponent's range, and it will be a strengthening contraction, where villain's range becomes stronger, moving away from the worst hands which go into the muck, and therefore your finishing equity will often dip close to 50%. That's okay, but what you don't want to do, especially in position where you could have just checked and ended the action there, is to be betting a sizing that reduces your final equity below 50%. A very common trap is to think, I have the best hand a lot here, and then bet bigger, but that's not really strong enough as a reason unless you have the best hand much more. Basically, 65% is a lot of the time to have the best hand. You'd be very happy with that, but it's not enough to bet big. It's not enough to make a B75 or larger for value. We're not talking about bluffing here. Okay, B75, this is more in the 75 to 80% band. This is what we call a tier 2 hand. In position on the river, it's very common if you look in a solver at the equity of the hands that are betting this big. You will see that it's high 70s, low 80s, generally speaking. To give you a flavor for what this really refers to in actual practicality, a hand that can B75 the river for value could be something like a really good top pair on a dry run out for a triple barrel, or it could be something like second pair after it checks to the river. It really depends on the action sequence, the position, the texture, all of these things, so I can't just say 2 pair plus is B75, that would be completely erroneous. B150 is your overbet sizing. It's the one we recommend, although of course other overbet sizes are viable too. Why do you not select B130 or B115? The reason is just consistency. I like there to be quite a big gulf between the bet sizes that we offer in the school so that you can really see the impact of choosing one instead of another. Tier 1 hands come in at usually 85 to 90% of the pot in equity by the river. On the turn, this could be lower because your opponent's equity could be consisting of draws instead of hands that beat you. But on the river, if you only have 85% equity, that means that you are just losing 15% of the time to better hands. B400 is the colossal overbet. We can call hands that use this tier 0 because they're practically invincible, given that B400 is actually supposed to cause an 80% fold frequency, a massive range contraction. Basically, B400 causes 80% of your opponent's range to fold. That's huge. That's just going to leave villain with very good hands. That's not a problem if you have a nutted hand. But if you only have a quite good hand, it's a severe catastrophe. So B400 for value is used sparingly. Only hands with massive landing equity are going to qualify for this sizing, but in many spots, particularly where your opponent's very condensed, this should be the sizing of choice for you with your nutted region. Don't shy away from it. It's okay to hardly ever get called if you're winning 4x pot when you do get called. Greed theorem. River greed theorem is the idea that if your hand lands on the river with massive equity and you choose to bet, you will do better by betting bigger and maximizing magnitude rather than by betting smaller and maximizing frequency. And the caveat here is that if villain is raising at a high frequency against smaller bets, then sometimes the smaller bet can be as good or even better. We've already learned about this concept, thankfully, when we studied Clark's theorem. Just always pay attention to range polarization. If a river card comes that dramatically promotes tons of your opponent's hands into near nutted hands, while simultaneously demoting others, good example of this is a 3 flush river, it may well be correct to use a lot of small bets and not that many massive bets. If, however, you feel that your range has a big nut advantage and your opponent is mostly capped and condensed compared to your range, then you'll want to go for max value with your very strong hands. Don't believe me? Here's the proof. On the left-hand column of this table, we have sizing stipulated as a percentage of the pot with 100% equity, assuming your hand has 100% equity here. So on the top left cell, we have a 5% pot size bet. In the bottom left, we have a 400% pot size bet, basically B5, B400. In the middle column, we have villain's call frequency in a neutral spot, assuming that neither player has an overall ranged advantage here. We have a nutted hand in this instance, but we don't have a big ranged advantage on the river. So this is basically 1 minus MDF as a decimal. It's pot odds norm fold equity for that sizing. This is the call frequency, sorry, so this is the opposite of that. And then we have surplus profit in EV as a percentage of the pot. Let's go through this together. If you bet 5% pot in a neutral world, you will make 96.3% of 5% pot, which is 4.81% pot in EV gain. This isn't your EV for betting, because your overall EV for betting also includes the dead money in the middle, but this is the EV gain of your bet. This is what your bet adds to whatever that entitlement was previously. When you bet 33% of the pot, a more normal sizing, but still a very lame one in position, what happens is that the pot odds norm is 25 and therefore MDF is 75%. You get called 3/4 of the time in such a spot. Therefore, you make 3/4 of 33% pot, which is 24.75% of the original pot. Now you're profiting by way more, 6 times more EV than if you bet 5% pot. That's interesting. When you multiply the sizing by 6, you multiply the EV gain in these situations. Then you double the sizing again, plus a bet. You go up to 75% pot. Well, now we know the pot odds norm fold equity, if you memorized your table, is going to be 43%. So villain calls 57% of the time, and now you earn 57% of 75 chips, which is 42.9% pot. Much better. B150, better still. Now you're getting called a minority of the time. So those of you out there who are seeking the satisfaction of the feeling of being paid, well, you're doing it wrong. You're succumbing to the half-blind fallacy. What you should be doing is focusing on overall EV gain in the long run. And if you run this a million times, you'll do way better, necessarily, by choosing the larger sizing than the smaller one, because of the times you get called just earning way more money. When you B400, villain's call frequency will be very small, only 20%, but your profit will be a whopping 80% of the pot. This is huge. So the difference between seeking a call almost always and seeking a call almost never is about 80% of this pot, 75% of this starting pot on the river in EV. That's so huge that I can't even quantify that for you. Losing that many big blinds because you were greedy about frequency would be a disaster. Of course, do pay attention to our caveat above. If this is a situation in which villain would raise you anyway if you bet 5% all the time, then there's no problem just betting 5% and then re-raising. But in many situations, people just don't like the raise button. And just because there are hands in villain's range that you could target, or you could even induce, people like this word, I hate it. Say I'm betting to induce a raise here. How often is he raising? Is it a spot where villain's polarized enough to raise frequently or not? Because if this is not a spot you're going to get raised a ton in, targeting the hands that do raise is a very bad kind of tunnel vision. Greed theorem is really important. You see people really struggle to get out of high rate games like microstakes games. These games can be borderline unbeatable sometimes because they just don't have big enough value bets in certain spots. This is one reason for it, among many others. I'll show you a graph now that describes the before and after equity of some hands just so we can get a better feel for how equity changes upon getting called. In this situation, again, we've reached this spot. By calling the b75 on the flop, the turn has gone check check, and then we have the chance to bet the river. We have the dominant line for each hand, the line that's usually chosen in the solver, down below. And then we're going to show the equity of that hand before and after betting the chosen sizing. So the dominant line here is check for Jack 8, but you can also make a very small value bet with this hand if you want. And when you make a small value bet with this hand, what really happens here is that your equity drops dramatically. If you do this, it's basically not even a value bet at all, and that's why check is the only real choice. But if you were going to choose a bet size, it would be small. You wouldn't want to bet this one big. That's why I've outlined the small bet here. A bigger bet would cost even more EV. This hand is simply checking here after calling b75. If your opponent's bet smaller on the flop or you think they're betting range, you can definitely value bet this hand on the river for a small bet. It's just that when they polarize by betting big on the flop, they don't really have enough worse jacks or bluff catchers that are paying this hand off even if it bets small. Again, you can't invest as much against the polarized range, so you can't invest anything. You beat zero here, effectively. Big dip from starting equity to landing equity. If I told you that your hand had 73% landing equity, you might feel like you should bet. But villain's range is too polar here. You've got to think about villain's polarization as well. King Jack is much better, and this hand does indeed choose to be 33. The reason it can pull off this bet size is that the equity drops much less. You might think King Jack and Jack 8 are quite similar. Why is the EV dip from starting to finishing equity for B33 so high, such a large dip? The reason for this is, of course, that many of villain's calls here are Jack X, and King Jack beats all of them, apart from Ace Jack, whereas Jack 8 loses to a lot of them. Queen 10 of clubs is a much stronger hand. This is one that is actually strong enough for a b75 in the solver, and the b75 is indeed the dominant line for this combo. It starts with a huge 92% equity. This is because villain will be betting a lot of the time on the turn with stronger value hands, probably pure, with ace queen plus, and therefore will get to the river with only a few better queens and a few flushes. Flush draws will very often be betting the turn also. This hand does worse when called, but because it's winning so often, it struggles to lose, basically. It has to run into a really rare flush, pocket fours, queen 4, something like this to lose here. 10-8 is a monster hand, it's a flush, and no surprise, it begins with a huge amount of equity, 98% to be precise. It could consider B400, but the problem is, at that point, you will skew your opponent's range a little bit too heavily towards better flushes. Not saying you will only get called by better flushes. This is another fallacy when students say, will only get called by better. Well, if that's the case, you're miles away from being able to value bet. That's absurd. But of course, if you get called and only have 50% equity for B400, that's pretty bad when you could have had 94% for B150. You don't want to cause too much of a contraction in your opponent's range, a contraction that's too great for the worth of your hand. That's what we're trying to avoid here, but we're trying to still, at the same time, push greed theorem to the max and make sure we earn the maximum amount our hand can. In other words, we reach the investment ceiling for each hand in our range in this spot. Finally, ace 7 of diamonds being a nutted hand can be 400 because basically it can't lose. B400 is always chosen with this hand in this spot. The solver thinks that due to the relative condensedness of your opponent's range, okay, it's not fully condensed, it's not fully polar, but because villain is mostly condensed and won't be raising a ton here if we bet smaller, the ace 7 is just inclined to bet very big and just try to maximize its EV that way. It would be better to check with ace 7 and go for a big check raise than it would to bet something medium, because what you're doing when you check is you're allowing villain to open the action at high frequency and you can still get your raise in, whereas when you make a medium-sized bet, you largely shut out raises. Not fully, but mostly. Let's talk a bit about the solution to the spot that we began looking at today, this Queen Jack 6, and try and understand exactly what's going on in this situation now. This is the overall strategy. You'll see that it really is a medley of different sizes, and at first glance this can look intimidating and confusing, borderline bewildering, but it's not. Because the tier system is so accurate, and because the equity of the value hands is basically the thing driving the strategy, what you want to do is understand this grid by looking at the lighter shades, obviously being the smaller bets, the darker purpler shades are the bigger bets. You want to understand that with the value band of hands that are betting for that purpose, the bigger ones are betting the bigger sizing. The weaker ones are betting the smaller sizing. That simple. Is this not exploitable? No. As long as you call raises with your B33 range often enough, you can't be exploited. You don't need the nuts to beat a bluff raise. Fallacy that you have to massively protect your B33 range in this spot. It should be mostly bad hands. Sometimes you can put some weaker hands into a checking range instead of B33ing them. You can bet a bit smaller sometimes with certain hands than their equity ceiling would suggest. Never upgrade a hand. You can never bet bigger with a value hand that's not of a sufficient tier. But for the most part, you don't see flushes in this spot betting small. If you look at 10-8 suited, 10-7, 9-8, 9-7, these only exist in diamond form, obviously. Bearing in mind that we've called a large flop C-bet to begin with here. We don't have 9-7 of clubs. And so we just go big all the time. We're using a B150 all the time with that hand. There is no small betting. There doesn't need to be. You don't have to protect your B33 range to the point that you're sabotaging your EV. You can protect it where it's okay to do so, and you'll see that some of the Queen X of Diamonds hands that are blocking the bluff catcher queen are going smaller and hoping to get bluff raised instead. That's totally fine. But they're not doing that because they're hell-bent on protecting the range. You don't need more than a bluff catcher to beat a bluff. Using your nuts as bluff catchers and betting tiny with them just so you're a bit more nutted when you get raised is not actually good poker. Here are some questions for you to solve. First off, what is the favorability of this spot for big blind? Why does 8-5 suited check here? What tier is Queen Jack and why does it bet small? How big a mistake would it be to check the 10-9 offsuit? I'll give you a minute to pause the video and have a crack at these and then we'll go over your answers. First off, the favorability for big blind is very good. What we have here is someone who's condensed on the flop heavily, then faced scattered aggression, so a bet and then a check from button. This is very good news. This turn bet that we see button here is exceedingly good news. It really boosts our EV significantly. The 4 of diamonds river card is great for us. The reason being that button's going to bet flush draws at a very high frequency on the turn, whereas we're just going to have them on this node a lot. When you hang around on the flop, when you choose to stick about in the hand, you intentionally and correctly shift your range towards hands that have something to do with the flop in terms of connectivity. You will call some hands here that are not anything to do with the flop, like pocket sevens sometimes, but you will not be moving away from the flop texture. You'll be moving towards it. Villain will do this a bit as well, but they'll be betting far more liberally with 5-4 of clubs, with ace-3, with king-7 than you will. You will not be calling as liberally as they will be betting with those hands. Therefore, what we see here is a phenomenon where the player that hung around by calling and condensed towards hitting the board texture very much enjoys river cards that are along the same theme as the flop. As this flop had 2 diamonds in it, this is a thematic river card that bolsters the strength of big blind's range further. We'll see more about rules for understanding these runouts in a second. So it's a very favourable world, and that obviously means that big blind is incentivized to bluff a lot whenever they have nothing. A lot of betting here. You can tell from the overall bet frequency on this river how few green boxes there are, just how good the world this is. Why does 8-5 suited check? Because it's slow playing. It's going for a check raise. You can check raise here. Button is still supposed to reopen sometimes. Whenever you can check raise, it's usually okay to do so with a value hand, not with air, because you can't count on your opponent betting and you would just give away your favourable bluff opportunity by checking. But with a value hand, you can generally check raise instead of value betting at some frequency. Out of position slow plays are much more normal than in position. A lot of people treat those two spots as the same thing, even though they're really not. What tier is Queen Jack and why does it bet small? Queen Jack is a tier 2 hand, at least. Probably tier 1 actually. It's an incredibly powerful hand in this spot. But what it's doing is downgrading its investment level because it's blocking calls so significantly. Hands that significantly block calls can be deemed anomaly hands. An anomaly hand is any combo which elects to choose a different size to those of a similar strength within the range. Therefore, something like Queen Jack, while it's good enough in terms of equity to bet bigger, and indeed the solver doesn't hate betting bigger with this hand, it's doing it sometimes, Small bets are the dominant choice because we begin to rely on bluff raises a bit more than calls since we're reducing the combos of calls. If I block a hand that's meant to call a bigger bet, it doesn't make as much sense to use that sizing. There'll be an EV hit for that sizing. I don't want to say we're targeting air, we're targeting raises here, because that sounds too strong, but we're definitely shifting our strategy towards something that relies on those hands giving us EV a bit more than the hands that we block. That's just sensible poker. How big a mistake would it be to check 10-9? An absolutely huge one. It would be absolutely terrible. Be one of the worst things I've ever seen. Don't do it. You're in a favourable world with nothing. Please bet that hand. If you don't bet that hand, I dread to think how bad your red line must look, your non-showdown winnings line, because you're passing up really profitable bluffs left, right and centre. Fix that ASAP if that applies to you. Let's move on to the low, innocuous sort of texture now. 8-8 deuce. This time villain chooses a more apt sizing for the texture. The reason B33 is a bit more sensible here is that big blind's range is more polarised, given that we have an 8 or we have nothing here the majority of the time. Using a big bet against such a polar range doesn't really make sense, and therefore sizing on relevantly paired flops is typically going to be smaller in a single raise pot where trips combos are abundant. In a 3-bet pot, we can largely ignore the presence of trips, and even more so in the 4-bet pot. Check on the turn is good news for big blind, gaining a big range advantage, going into the 9 of spades river. The 9 of spades river is sadly not a great card for big blind. One good thing is that 9x combos will quite often bet the turn as a bluff. That said, the 9 is a card that we fold fairly frequently on the flop, and button still has its some frequency. However, it's still going to be a reasonable spot. Focus questions, again, favourability. Why does King Jack not bluff on this node? The King Jack offsuit is pure checking for big blind here. Why does 5s bet 75% of the pot? And why does Ace 8 off lose EV if it bets big? That's your 4 questions. Get stuck in, give you a few minutes, unpause the video when you're ready. Okay, favourability. The favourability here for big blind is again pretty good. It's not quite as good as last time, I wouldn't think. The reason being the run out is just a little bit worse, with not any flushes completing. Nothing to do with the flop coming on the turn or river, basically, right? We'll talk more about a rule for really grading the run out and seeing who it's favourable for in a minute. But yeah, this is still a favourable spot where we're entitled to more of the pot than our foe is here. That's really common in these situations where we have a river probe having condensed on a flop by calling. Heavily condensed, I might add. Why does King Jack offsuit not bluff? The problem with bluffing King Jack off is that although it's a very plus EV thing to do, it's not as good as checking. King Jack off has some showdown value. Because this isn't as much of a favourable world as before, we don't want to dip too far into that showdown value when we're bluffing, because we don't have quite as much fold equity as the previous sim, I don't believe. Another problem here for King Jack is that it's removing some folds from villain's range blockers, but that's neither here nor there. That's a little bit more minuscule a factor. By and large, the hand just has too much showdown value to want to bluff, even though there is more fold equity than the break-even point. Why does 5s B75? Because the texture is barren and dry, and 5s is actually a very strong holding on this texture. Villain has not caused a lot of filtering in either range through his flop bet and turn check. He's very capped. There will not be many pairs in button's range at all because 9x will just bet the turn a lot as a bluff, or at least it should. Therefore, hand like 4s is probably coming in at 80% equity here, 75% is good enough for the B75. Don't glance at 4s or 5s or 6s and think, bad pair check. Don't judge your hand by what it would be on the average runout. This is not the average runout, this is a late position node on an incredibly still lake texture. In grade 1 we introduced the term still lake, if that sounds like nonsense to you, to refer to textures where nothing much is happening. There are no ripples in the water, and hands like random pairs are just really good. This would be less good had there been more filtering, had the board been wetter, and we don't really need to feel like this hand is just mediocre on such a favourable board for this hand and for our range. Why does Ace 8 offsuit lose EV if it bets big? Because the ace is one of villain's main calls, main bluff catches. Ace high here is the bulk of villain's bluff catch region because of the high frequency with which they bet pairs plus on the turn. Blocking a bluff catcher makes your hand a little bit more suitable for the purpose of check raising or check calling, depending on the strength, in this case check raising, and we'll see more on that when we look at the out of position game next time and become tricky, trappy, snakes in the grass, waiting to pounce on our opponent's aggression on the river. So going for check raise here with ace 8 is the default play, or going for a block bet and hoping you get raised. In practice, don't block bet here against humans. I don't like to talk too exploitatively in this course because we're trying to lay down the foundations of theory The problem with the solver's suggestion of block betting here in reality is that people just will not raise you at all, really, having bet flop and check turn. It's just not going to happen enough. Against a really strong opponent, it's okay. I just really prefer checking here and then attacking. The soaking mess board now, one that we would have referred to as a tsunami in grade 1 when we talked about texture. Ace 7, 5, 4, 10, 4 flush is a really unique kind of texture. Have a look at this range, study it a little bit in this river probe spot, big blind against under the gun, and then try to answer the following questions. What's the favorability for big blind in this spot? Why is B33 largely the preferred sizing? What tier are Jack 9 suited and Queen 9 suited, and why? Assuming that they're not diamonds, okay? So assuming that these are some other form of Jack 9. Why is Ace Queen suited betting, and why is this allowed? I think. What's going on here? Well, the favorability is not so good this time. You can actually figure this out because there are quite a few hands that look really bad here that aren't bluffing. If Queen Jack offsuit or King Queen offsuit or something like this is not able to bluff here despite having very little showdown value, this just can't be as favorable a world as we were in previously. Why is B33 preferred? Because the opponent's range has just been uncapped and massively polarized. There are a lot of hands in under the gun's range like King X with a diamond, Kings with a diamond, King Queen, etc. There are also just other big offsuit broadways and underpairs to the ace that do really well in this river. And don't think that just because under the gun check the turn that they don't have these hands here. The problem here is that a lot of those hands actually have showdown value on the turn and are therefore always checking back, like queens with a diamond. So we need to be really careful here that we don't lump this in with the spots we looked at previously. Range polarization here is completely different to what it was previously. Villain's range is much more polarized on a run out like this, even though he's taken a line that typically denotes a more condensed range. Texture can overrule action sequence when it comes to range composition and polarization. If villain is more polar, we can expect to get raised more. Thus, our nutted hands are not relying on making giant bets anymore, and greed theorem has become irrelevant. We go small, we wait for raises, then we pounce. When we're bluffing, we accommodate the wants and wishes of our value region, we go small as well. Biggest sizing we can use here is something like B75, for the most part. What tier are Jack 9 and Queen 9? When it comes to being bluffs, they're actually tier 5, and the idea there is that they are blocking a lot of the flushes in villain's range. If you have Queen 9 of clubs here, for example, and you've made a slightly loose call on the flop, you're going to get to this node in a situation where you have nothing. And you're also in a spot where your hand has blockers to something like queens with a diamond, kings with a diamond, depending on what it is, jacks with a diamond, nines with a diamond. These are the most likely hands under the gun has here for value. So it's good to block those when you're bluffing. Why is ace queen suited betting? This is actually a value bet. This is actually the kind of bet that you make, and because you make it small enough, and you bear in mind that villain still has a lot of ace-x bluff catchers and stuff if you bet small, you survive with this bet. You don't have a lot of equity. You only have like 50% equity when called or something. Maybe not even. But because you're out of position, you have to understand that checking is not such a great alternative. Let's move on to discuss bet check bet now. So in river probe situations, we had the advantage of having condensed our range by calling a flop bet. This is our range, it's lime green, indicating quite good, lots of power 2 hands, or in other words, knives, whereas villain is going to be more spoon or gun heavy, depending on their sizing. The bigger the sizing, the more the extent to which that's true. This lack of bad hands or wooden spoons made the river probe spot generally favourable for us and meant that we had to bluff on most textures with low showdown value, though not all textures. Some textures negated our advantage that we got from actions. But in bet check bet lines, where we have been the one to bet the flop, turn is checked back, and then we have the chance to bet the river, we're in a scattered aggression opportunity here. Now we are both polarized and capped. And polarizing yourself and then condensing yourself is awful. It's not that you shouldn't ever do it, you have to do it. You know, you have to play that way, that's how poker works, but it's bad for your range strength. That's one of the nodes on which your range is at its weakest. When we remove our medium hands by betting flop and then remove our best hands by checking turn, we move towards the middle and the middle bottom. Villain, on the other hand, doesn't have these really low EV hands here depicted by the orange bar in our range, and it's just going to have a solid showdown value-y mediocre equity range. That's going to be better than a range that's full of garbage like we have. So it's no longer so clear that we have a range advantage on these nodes. On some we will, but it will be because we've been bailed out by the texture. Let's learn a protocol understanding when we have a range advantage, or I should say are in a favourable world EV-wise, in a bet check bet opportunity, and when we're not. This is what it looks like when we land on the river. We really are the David here in the famous David versus Goliath matchup, and villain is Goliath, when we're the bet check bet person. Reason for that is that we have taken this fatal combination of betting and then checking. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, you have to do that a lot, but it's just a bad spot for your range when you do. Just like when you fold, you have a really weak range. Still meant to fold. The bet check bet theorem basically says that spots are often close to neutral, or even unfavourable for the preflop raiser. And with bet flop, turn goes check check, chance to bet river. We very often have to be selective with bluffing on these nodes due to our crippling range disadvantage. So if we're the in position player, this will go away a bit when big blind then checks the river, because big blind has a chance to make a lot of value bets here, and when they don't, although they won't be completely capped, they will be largely capped. Remember, when you're in position, this isn't as bad as when you're out of position. When you're out of position with the bet check bet opportunity, you incur the full impact of the range disadvantage. But then I guess your opponents check back on the turn, so it's maybe not as bad. But here's some textural guidance. 3 types of texture for you to memorize here. This is a very important part of the course to make sure that you internalize, so definitely spend a bit of time here. 1. When the river card is extremely favourable for the raiser because it heavily connects with hands with which he would have bet the flop, but with which the caller would have folded the flop, then the preflop raiser is the one in the favourable one. So in other words, when a big obnoxious card comes, it has nothing to do with the flop. Remember, the caller of the flop bet, the condenser, likes cards that are to do with that flop because they had a reason to hang around. Therefore, when the card is impactful, hits the preflop raiser's c-bet range but has nothing to do with the hands with which big blind hung around on the flop and called a bet with, it's going to be a favourable world for in position. So textures like 5-5 deuce 10 jack are going to completely negate the normal disadvantage incurred through that action sequence and actually hand over the range advantage again to the preflop aggressor. Look for these big unconnected cards that don't gel with the flop but do improve your preflop range. These are the ones that put you back into a favourable world and very much redeem what would otherwise be a pretty lousy situation for your range. Innocuous runouts usually lead to neutral worlds after big blind checks. Not always, it depends how innocuous they are. A low card that makes straights will usually be better for the big blind, but something like Queen 9-9 4 deuce is going to be roughly neutral. And runouts that relate to the flop generally lead to unfavourable worlds after the big blind checks the river. This could mean that the middle card or third pair card or even top card pairs, it could mean that a flush or straight comes in that was abundant in the flop caller's range, and it's just a spot where you have to understand that this is about as bad as it gets for you. You would bet a lot of the hands that connected with such a river on the turn. By the same token, when you bet the turn and you get a river that makes a load of straights, that's often quite good for you if it's like a high straight with which you have a lot of combos around. We'll wrap up today's class with a look at our first 3-bet pot that we've really talked about in detail. The first thing you'll maybe notice here is that this B60 is not one of our standard sizing toolkits for the single raise pot. The reason we actually add this into our toolkit in a 3-bet pot is that the SPR is smaller, more money is in there already compared to stack, and therefore we're already much closer to our investment ceiling than we would be in a single raise pot. This is the sim. This is the way that small blind is playing this bet check bet opportunity out of position. And here are your questions. What can we infer from the play of Jack 10 here? Bear in mind that Jack 10 is just merely Jack high. There are no flushes possible in this runout. Jack high is checking half the time. What can you infer about the world? Is this turn good, bad, or neutral for our range? What do you think? And why does King 10 suited pure check? 3 questions to answer. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do so, and then we'll go over the answers. Okay, I'll assume you've unpaused the video. We can infer from the play of Jack 10 here that small blind is in a very unfavourable world. In any sort of neutral world or favourable world, a hand like this is going to be bluffing all the time. The reason that this hand isn't always bluffing is that it's not a premium bluff candidate. It doesn't have the best blockers. It's blocking some combos of folds by blocking a few of the backdoor draws that call it flop that have a 10 in them or a jack in them, like jack suited, etc. And therefore this hand is just not going to be that great blocker-wise. If the world was favourable, that wouldn't matter, of course. We would just be betting this hand anyway, but in a less favourable world, this hand is just checking a lot of the time. Is this turn good, bad, or neutral for our range? It's okay. I'd say closest thing here is to say that it's neutral. The problem is that it's not one of the best broadways for our range. When button calls flop here, they're going to have a lot of ace-x, more so than they're going to have king x, queen x, jack x, 10x. Also pre-flop, the ace is just a bit more prevalent than those lower broadways. What this means is that the ace of hearts is not as good a card as it looks. you did grade 1, you may remember the ace turn fallacy, where people think an ace is better than it is for the flop aggressor. In some configurations where button doesn't call ace high on the flop because the flop is not quite so bone dry as this, the ace is going to be okay for small blind, but here on such a dry board, button is going to be incentivized to hang around with a lot of ace-x. So in other words, if ace-x is a good hand on the flop, and button then hangs around with it and an ace comes on the turn, this just can't be a great thing for small blind's range. Small blind, meanwhile, will be c-betting a lot of ace-x, but hands like ace-jack, ace-10 here, and some ace-queen are going to be quite frequent checks. Ace-king is more of a value bet, and weaker ace-x might be bluffing at a higher frequency. Finally, king-10 suited pure checks here, because the hand is a tier 7 bluff. It's blocking far too many folds. It doesn't actually have any showdown value here, because button, being in a favourable world, is supposed to bluff us out of the pot whenever they have a worse hand than king-10, but king-10's blockers are bad, and we just have to settle for 0 EV in an unfavourable world. Unfavourable worlds, they suck. You just can't bluff really like you can in better worlds for your range. The homework task for this lecture is to look at these two situations, big blind versus cutoff in a single raised pot. 2-bet pot means single raised pot. The board comes down like this, and on the flop, cutoff B33s and gets called. Turn goes check, check, and we have a bet opportunity for big blind here, out of position. So I want you to think about this spot and also spot 2 with the questions below. Spot 2 is blind versus blind single raised pot, and this is a bet check bet opportunity for the small blind player. Bet flop, get called, turn check, check, and small blind has the opportunity to bet river. I want you to imagine here that a beginner is asking you to explain why these two strategies differ in lots of ways. Write out an explanation that compares the strategy recommended by a solver in hand 1 and hand 2. When you write out your explanation of how these things are different, try to talk about sizing choices, favorability, bluff selection, here's a value hand, and anomaly hands. I'm now going to go over the answers to this task, so please make sure that you don't press play until you've completed the assignment. So the first spot is obviously a much more favourable world for the out of position player than the second one. The reason being that the heavily condensing action in the first world is just going to favour the big blind's range. You could argue that the king turn is kind of good for the cutoff, and it is in a sense, but also cutoff will be betting a lot of king queen ace king combos and things like this on the turn, and the king is something to do with the flop, and remember that the person who calls the flop often likes cards that are something to do with it that come out later. Therefore, this is definitely a less favourable world. On this node, there will be all sorts of different hands in the big blind player's range. When we think about what these hands are, many of them are just going to be thin value hands. Some are going to be much stronger and B75 worthy, and there will even be some really nutted hands in this range like pocket fives or something as well. Therefore, it's very normal in your output to have observed a lot of different bet sizes here. Bluff selection is going to be fairly liberal. The big blind player is going to be able to bluff here with all kinds of air and should turn low showdown value hands like 9-7 into a bluff all the time. Here's a value hand. They're going to be assignable by bet size. If you've given the solver the same 4 bet sizes that I like to give, you will see it using all of them with different sizes here. But there are some anomaly hands. There are a few weird looking hands, such as king 10, that heavily block the calling range, that might want to play differently, even though they appear very good. You're going to also have a hand like king jack here that just blocks absolutely everything it can get value from, and that hand may well just elect to check in your sim. That's why. Again, an anomaly hand is something that has similar equity to other hands in the range, but takes a completely different action due to its blocker effect. The second spot is much worse for the out of position player. Here the small blind is going to be quite selective about what they bluff. They're going to be showing down hands that have any showdown value whatsoever. And you'll note that the turn was a disastrous card that had everything to do with the flop. Cards that have everything to do with the flop are always going to favour the caller here. It's true that big blind doesn't have that many queen X when they check back on the turn, but their range is still dominating the small blind range in terms of equity and EV. Sizing choices here for small blind. This is where it gets quite interesting. As an out of position player, small blind is not supposed to be seriously capped on this turn. The small blind's range is going to be able to use giant sizes at some frequency. Because the in position player here is the one that's really capped, small blind can and should build some giant bets, as well as some smaller ones. Small blind will have some thin, blocky hands here. We'll have some B75s and B150s, and potentially some absolute monsters as well, such as pocket sixes. The favorability is